The candles in the dining hall burned low, and the laughter around the table felt sharp enough to cut skin. Eleanor Whitmore sat with her hands folded in her lap, her plate barely touched, while her aunt's voice rose above the clinking of silver and crystal. "No one will want her," Lady Constance Ashford said, tilting her head toward a group of guests as if Eleanor were not sitting only a few feet away. "Not with that dowry, not with that quiet, dull manner of hers. I have tried, truly I have, but some girls simply are not made for good marriages." The words landed like a slap, though no one raised a hand. Eleanor felt her face grow warm, her throat tighten, and for a moment she thought she might rise from the table and leave the room entirely. But she had learned, over the past year, that showing pain only invited more of it. So she sat still. She kept her eyes on the small piece of bread on her plate, and said nothing at all. Not everyone at the table laughed. At the far end, seated near the fireplace, a tall man in a dark gray coat had gone quiet. His name was Nathaniel Graves, the Duke of Carrickmuir, and he had come to this gathering only because his late friend, Eleanor's father, had once asked him, years ago, to look after his family if anything should happen to him. Nathaniel had not expected to keep that promise so soon, nor had he expected to find the promise so difficult to fulfill from a distance, watching a girl be mocked by her own family and doing nothing about it. He studied Eleanor for a long moment. She did not cry. She did not argue. She simply endured, the way a person endures a storm they cannot stop, waiting only for it to pass. There was something about that quiet strength that stayed with him long after the dinner ended, long after the carriages pulled away from the house and the candles were finally put out for the night. Eleanor had not always lived like this. A year earlier, she had a home filled with warmth, a father who read to her every evening from his enormous collection of books, and a mother whose laughter could be heard from the garden all the way to the kitchen. That life ended on a wet autumn night, when the carriage carrying her parents overturned on the road outside their estate. Eleanor was told the news the next morning by a servant who could barely finish the sentence before breaking into tears himself. After the funeral, there had been no question of where Eleanor would go. Her father's estate was modest, most of it tied up in debts he had never spoken of, and the small dowry left to her was far from enough to secure the kind of match that society expected. Her aunt, Lady Constance, agreed to take her in, not out of love, but because refusing would have looked poorly to the rest of their circle. From the very first day, Eleanor understood that she was a guest in her aunt's house, not a member of the family, and that her welcome depended entirely on how little trouble she caused. Constance was a woman who measured everything by appearance. Her own daughters, 2 years younger than Eleanor, were dressed in the finest fabrics and taught to smile at exactly the right moments. Eleanor, by comparison, wore altered dresses that had once belonged to her mother, carefully mended so the frayed edges would not show. She was polite. She was careful. She tried, in every way she knew, to be no burden at all. But no matter how quiet she remained, her aunt seemed to resent her presence more with each passing month, as though Eleanor's very existence was a reminder of a debt that could never be repaid. The dinner that night had been meant to introduce Eleanor to society, a chance, Constance claimed, to find her a suitable match before she became, in her aunt's words, too old to be considered fresh. But it had become clear within the first hour that Constance had no real intention of helping Eleanor succeed. She wanted witnesses. She wanted the room to see that she had tried, so that when no proposal came, she could say she had done everything a good aunt could do, and the failure would rest entirely on Eleanor's shoulders. Nathaniel Graves understood exactly what he had witnessed, even if the rest of the room chose to look away. He was a man who valued honesty above almost everything else, a trait that had earned him both respect and loneliness in equal measure. Since the death of his younger sister several years before, he had withdrawn from much of society, attending only the gatherings he could not politely avoid. He had little patience for the games played at these dinners, the careful cruelty disguised as conversation, the way people smiled while cutting each other down without ever raising their voice. He left the gathering that night without speaking to Eleanor directly. It would not have been proper, not with her aunt watching so closely, ready to spin any small kindness into gossip. But the image of her sitting quietly through her own humiliation stayed with him during the carriage ride home, through the long hallways of Carrickmuir Hall, and into the late hours when sleep refused to come. He thought of his sister, Margaret, who had also been quiet, also been underestimated by people who mistook gentleness for weakness. She had died of a fever when she was only 19, and Nathaniel had spent every day since wondering if there had been something more he could have done, some way he could have protected her from a world that so often failed to see a person's true worth until it was too late. He did not know Eleanor Whitmore. He owed her nothing beyond the promise made to her father, but something in him refused to let the matter rest. The following morning, He sat at his desk in the study, staring at a blank sheet of paper for a long while, before finally picking up his pen. He did not write to Lady Constance. He wrote directly to Eleanor, a decision that would have scandalized half of society had they known of it, though he took care to keep the letter formal and entirely proper. In it, he explained that he was in the process of cataloging his late mother's library, a task that required someone with knowledge of literature and careful attention to detail. He mentioned that her father, a respected scholar in his own right, had once spoken to him of Eleanor's love of books, and he wondered if she might be willing to assist him for a few weeks, with proper compensation and a chaperone present at all times, as was expected. It was not a romantic gesture. It was not even on the surface a personal one, but it was an opportunity, the first genuine opportunity Eleanor had been offered since her parents' death, and when the letter arrived at the Ashford house 2 days later, it caused a stir that no one in the household had expected. Constance read the letter twice before handing it to Eleanor, her expression caught somewhere between suspicion and calculation. A duke, however briefly, wanted something from her niece. It did not matter to Constance that the request was for cataloging books rather than courtship. What mattered was the connection itself, the possibility that something might come of it, some benefit that could reflect well on the family name. "You will accept, of course," Constance said, as though there had ever been any question of Eleanor refusing. "A duke does not extend such invitations without reason. Perhaps you are not entirely without use after all." Eleanor said nothing in response, though the comment stung in its own quiet way. She had grown used to being spoken of as though her worth needed to be proven, as though every kindness shown to her was somehow suspicious until confirmed useful. But beneath the sting, something else stirred in her, something she had not felt in a long time: curiosity. A small, careful hope that perhaps this invitation was exactly what it appeared to be, a chance to do something meaningful, even if only for a few weeks. She thought of her father's study back home, the smell of old paper and leather bindings, the hours she had spent as a child sitting on the floor while he explained the histories behind each book on his shelves. She had loved that world once, before grief and obligation had buried it beneath the weight of survival. The thought of returning to it, even in someone else's library, felt like being offered a small piece of the life she had lost. That evening, Eleanor sat by the window of the small room she had been given at her aunt's house, watching the last light fade over the garden below. She held the letter in her hands, reading it once more, this time not as her aunt had read it, searching for advantage, but as herself, searching for meaning. The handwriting was neat and controlled, the words polite but not cold. There was nothing in the letter that suggested pity, and for that, more than anything else, she found herself grateful. She did not know Nathaniel Graves beyond his reputation, which painted him as distant, serious, and unmoved by the ordinary pleasures of society. She had heard whispers that he rarely attended gatherings, that he had grown colder since the death of his sister, that he cared more for his estate and his books than for the company of others. None of that had prepared her for the strange, quiet kindness of his letter, nor for the way it had arrived at exactly the moment she needed to be reminded that she was still capable of being seen as something more than a burden. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the small wooden box where she kept the few remaining items from her old life: a handkerchief embroidered by her mother, a pressed flower from her father's garden, a single page torn from one of his favorite books. It felt strange to place something so new beside things so old, but somehow, it belonged there all the same. Downstairs, she could hear her aunt speaking to one of her daughters about the letter, already imagining the social possibilities it might bring, already planning how she might use this small connection to elevate the family's standing. Eleanor did not resent her aunt for this, not entirely. She understood, in a distant way, that Constance had her own fears, her own pressures, her own definition of what it meant to survive in a world that judged women so harshly by their marriages and their fortunes. But understanding did not make the years of quiet cruelty hurt any less. For the first time since her parents' death, however, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine a future that was not entirely shaped by her aunt's judgment of her. It was a small thing, an invitation to catalog a library, nothing more. But it was hers. No one had arranged it for her benefit or manipulated it into being. A man she had never properly spoken to had noticed something in her worth acknowledging, and in a life that had offered her so little acknowledgement in the past year, that single fact felt like the beginning of something important. She did not yet know how deeply her life was about to change, nor how much both joy and pain still waited ahead of her. She only knew, as she extinguished the candle by her bed and settled into the darkness, that for the first time in a long while, she was looking forward to the morning. The carriage that would carry her to Carrickmuir Hall was arranged for the following week, and though Eleanor tried to keep her expectations modest, A quiet excitement had already begun to take root in her chest, one she did not yet dare to name. Across the city, in his own quiet study, Nathaniel Graves sat once more at his desk, staring at the reply that had arrived that afternoon. A short, carefully worded acceptance, written in Eleanor's own hand. He read it several times, searching, though he could not have said exactly what for. Perhaps some sign that he had done the right thing, perhaps some hint of the person behind the careful words. He did not yet know how much this single decision would come to matter, how it would draw him out of the isolation he had built so carefully around himself, or how the quiet girl from the dinner party would soon become someone he could not imagine his life without. He only knew that for the first time in a long while, he found himself looking forward to a day that had not yet arrived, and that the feeling, unfamiliar as it was, did not feel unwelcome at all. The gates of Carrickmuir Hall rose taller than anything Eleanor had seen since leaving her father's estate, iron and stone standing against a pale morning sky. As the carriage rolled up the long gravel drive, she felt her hands tighten in her lap, a mixture of nerves and something close to wonder settling over her. The house itself was vast, built of gray stone softened by ivy along its western wall, with windows so large they seemed to catch and hold the entire morning light. A housekeeper named Mrs. Averley greeted her at the door, a stout woman with a kind face and sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail of Eleanor's plain traveling dress without judgment. "The Duke is expecting you in the West Library," she said, leading Eleanor through a hall lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. "He does not often take visitors this early, so I dare say you have made quite an impression already." Eleanor said nothing, though the comment settled uneasily in her stomach. She did not want to be seen as someone who had made an impression on a duke. She wanted, more than anything, to be useful, to prove that the opportunity given to her had not been wasted, and to return to her aunt's house, however briefly, with something that was entirely her own accomplishment. The West Library, when she finally reached it, took her breath away in a manner she had not expected. Shelves rose from floor to ceiling on every wall, filled with books whose spines bore the marks of decades, some centuries, of careful collection. A ladder on brass wheels stood against one wall, and tall windows let in soft morning light that fell across stacks of volumes waiting to be sorted. In the center of the room, seated at a large desk surrounded by open books and loose papers, sat Nathaniel Graves. He rose when she entered, offering a small, formal bow. "Miss Whitmore, thank you for coming." "Thank you for the invitation, Your Grace," Eleanor replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I must admit, I did not expect a library of this size." "It belonged to my mother," he said, gesturing toward the shelves. "She collected books the way other women collect jewelry. When she passed, I could not bring myself to disturb any of it for a long while. I am afraid the collection has grown rather disorganized as a result." There was something in the way he spoke of his mother, brief and careful, that told Eleanor this was a subject he did not often discuss. She recognized the tone immediately, having used it herself countless times when speaking of her own parents. It was the voice of someone who had learned to carry grief quietly, so as not to burden others with its weight. For the first hour, their conversation remained strictly professional. Nathaniel explained the system he hoped to establish, organizing the books by subject and then by date, creating a written record so that future generations might make better use of the collection than he had managed to in the years since his mother's passing. Eleanor listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions, and within a short time, the two of them had settled into an easy rhythm, moving between shelves, comparing notes, and filling page after page with careful lists. It was not until the second day that their conversation began to shift into something less formal. Eleanor had come across a small, worn book of poetry tucked between two much larger volumes, its pages soft with age. She opened it carefully, and a faint smile crossed her face as she read the inscription on the first page. "Is something amusing?" Nathaniel asked, glancing up from his own work. "This belonged to a child," Eleanor said, showing him the page. "See here, the handwriting is uneven, as though a young hand wrote it. To myself, so I never forget how the garden smelled in June." Nathaniel took the book gently, studying the inscription for a long moment, before a faint, rare smile touched his own face. "That was my sister's handwriting," he said quietly. "Margaret. She used to write little notes like that in nearly everything she owned, as though she were afraid of forgetting even the smallest details of her life. She sounds like she noticed things most people overlook," Eleanor said. "She did," Nathaniel agreed, his voice softer now. "She noticed everything. It was, I think, both her gift and her burden. She felt things very deeply, more deeply than most people around her understood. I did not always understand it myself, not until it was too late to tell her so." Eleanor did not press further, sensing the weight behind his words. But she did not look away either. She had learned, in the months since her parents' death, that sometimes the kindest thing a person could offer was simply the willingness to listen, without demanding more than someone was ready to give. "I lost my parents a year ago," she said after a moment. "A carriage accident. I still find myself some mornings forgetting for just a moment that they are gone. And then I remember, and it feels almost as painful as the first day." Nathaniel looked at her then, really looked at her, as though seeing her clearly for the first time. "I am sorry," he said simply, without the practiced sympathy she had grown so used to hearing from others. "Grief does not follow any timeline it is willing to share with us. I have learned that much at least." From that day forward, their working hours in the library became something more than simple employment. They spoke of their families, their childhoods, the small details of life that made a person who they were. Eleanor learned that Nathaniel had inherited his title far younger than he had expected, following his father's sudden illness, and that the weight of responsibility had settled onto his shoulders before he felt truly ready to carry it. He learned that Eleanor's father had spent years quietly managing debts he never spoke of, determined to protect his family from worry, even as his own health began to fail under the strain. Neither of them spoke of these things easily, but in each other's presence, the words seemed to come more freely than they had with anyone else in a long while. Eleanor found herself looking forward to the carriage ride to Carrickmuir Hall each morning, and Nathaniel, though he would not have admitted it aloud, found himself watching the drive from his study window, waiting for the first sign of her arrival. It was on the 9th day of her work in the library that Eleanor discovered something that would remain with her long after that particular afternoon had ended. She had climbed the brass ladder to reach a high shelf, and in reaching for a heavy volume, lost her footing. She let out a small cry as she felt herself begin to fall, but before she could hit the ground, steady hands caught her, keeping her safely upright. "Are you hurt?" Nathaniel asked, his voice tight with concern as he helped her regain her footing. "No," Eleanor said, breathless, very aware of how close they were standing. "Thank you, I was careless." "You were reaching for a book I should have retrieved myself," he said, though he did not step back immediately. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the quiet of the library settling around them like something fragile that neither wished to disturb. "Nathaniel," Eleanor said softly, using his given name for the first time. "Thank you, not just for catching me. For all of this, I had begun to believe I was of little use to anyone. This past week has reminded me that perhaps I was wrong." "You were never of little use," he said, his voice quieter now, more serious than she had heard it before. "I do not know who convinced you otherwise, but I hope in time, you come to see yourself as I have come to see you these past days." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm, uncertain how to respond to words so direct, so entirely unlike the careful, guarded conversations she had grown used to in her aunt's household. She stepped back slightly, gathering herself, though the warmth of the moment lingered long after they had returned to their separate tasks. Over the following weeks, their friendship deepened into something neither of them had expected, nor fully understood. They discussed books late into the afternoon, sometimes disagreeing passionately over the meaning of a passage, sometimes falling into comfortable silence as they worked side by side. Nathaniel began to smile more often, a fact Mrs. Averley noted quietly to the other staff, remarking that she had not seen the Duke laugh so freely since before his sister's passing. Eleanor, in turn, began to walk with a little more confidence, to speak a little more freely, to allow herself small moments of joy she had denied herself since her parents' death. She still returned each evening to her aunt's house, where Constance continued to treat her with the same cool distance as always, though now laced with a new curiosity about what exactly was taking place at Carrickmuir Hall each day. "You seem different," Constance remarked one evening, studying Eleanor across the dinner table with narrowed eyes. "Has something happened between you and the Duke?" "We are cataloging his library," Eleanor said carefully, nothing more. But even as she said the words, she was not entirely certain they were true. Something had shifted between herself and Nathaniel, something she could not yet name, though she felt its presence in every conversation, every shared glance, every small kindness exchanged between them in the quiet hours of the afternoon. Neither of them spoke openly of what was growing between them, both aware of the vast difference in their stations, both cautious of hoping for something that society might never allow. But in the quiet of the library, surrounded by books that had once belonged to the people they had loved and lost, Eleanor Whitmore and Nathaniel Graves found, in each other, a companionship neither had expected nor dared to imagine before. As the weeks passed, however, whispers had already begun to travel beyond the walls of Carrickmuir Hall, carried by servants, by guests, by the wide and watchful eyes of society. Whispers that would soon threaten to unravel everything the two of them had so carefully, so quietly built. It began, as most damaging rumors do, with something small. A footman at Carrickmuir Hall mentioned to a maid at a neighboring estate that the Duke had taken to laughing during his afternoons in the library, something none of the staff had witnessed since the death of his sister. The maid mentioned it to her mistress, who repeated it at a card game, adding her own small embellishment for the sake of a better story. Within 2 weeks, the tale had grown far beyond its original shape, twisting from simple observation into something far more scandalous. A duke supposedly enchanted, a poor relation, supposedly scheming her way into a fortune she did not deserve. Eleanor first became aware of the whispers at a small gathering hosted by one of her aunt's acquaintances, a modest afternoon tea meant for polite conversation and little else. She had barely taken her seat before she noticed the sideways glances, the whispers behind raised fans, the way conversation seemed to pause slightly whenever she drew near. "I hear the Duke of Carrickmuir has taken quite an interest in cataloging," said one woman, her voice pitched just loud enough to be overheard, though her eyes remained fixed politely on her teacup. "Though I understand it is not entirely the books that have caught his attention." A ripple of quiet laughter followed, and Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with familiar dread. She kept her expression composed, the way she had trained herself to do over the past year, though inside, something cold had settled deep in her chest. She had known, of course, that their friendship would eventually draw attention. What she had not expected was how quickly kindness could be twisted into scandal, how easily an honest connection could be reshaped into something shameful by people who knew nothing of the truth. Constance, for her part, had begun to change her approach entirely. Where once she had spoken of Eleanor with dismissive indifference, she now found ways to insert herself into every conversation regarding the Duke, claiming credit for arranging what she called a promising match, despite having played no part in it beyond delivering an insult that had, ironically, first caught Nathaniel's attention. "I always knew there was more to my niece than most people realized," Constance told a group of visiting ladies one afternoon, entirely unaware, or perhaps entirely uncaring, that Eleanor stood close enough to hear every word. "It takes a discerning eye to see true worth beneath modest circumstances, and I flatter myself that I raised her well enough to be noticed by a man of such standing." Eleanor said nothing, though the hypocrisy of the statement burned in a way she had not expected. She thought of the dinner party months before, of her aunt's careless cruelty spoken so casually in front of an entire room, and the memory sat uneasily alongside this new, convenient version of events her aunt now presented to the world. The whispers, however, soon grew into something far more dangerous than idle gossip. Word of the Duke's growing attachment reached Lord Reginald Graves, Nathaniel's cousin and, until recently, the presumed heir to the Carrickmuir title, given that Nathaniel had shown no interest in marriage since his sister's death. Reginald had spent years quietly enjoying the benefits of his position as likely heir, borrowing against future expectations, cultivating relationships built on the assumption that the Carrickmuir fortune would eventually pass to him. The thought of Nathaniel marrying, particularly marrying someone capable of producing an heir of his own, threatened everything Reginald had built his future upon. Reginald was not a man given to open conflict. He preferred instead the quiet, careful work of undermining others from a safe distance, a skill he had perfected over years of navigating society's more treacherous currents. Within days of learning of Eleanor's growing closeness to his cousin, he had begun making careful inquiries into her family's history, searching for any weakness he might exploit. He found what he was looking for in an old business dispute involving Eleanor's father, a disagreement over an investment that had soured years before Eleanor was even born. The details were mundane, the kind of financial disagreement common among businessmen of the era, resolved eventually through proper legal channels, with no lasting consequence to anyone's reputation. But mundane facts, Reginald knew, could be reshaped into something far more damaging, with the right careful phrasing. He began circulating a carefully worded story, suggesting that Eleanor's father had been involved in something closer to fraud than dispute, that the family's financial troubles stemmed not from misfortune but from dishonesty, and that Eleanor herself, whether through inherited character or deliberate scheming, could not be trusted to marry into a family as respected as the Graves lineage. He was careful never to state these claims outright, preferring instead the subtle art of implication, a raised eyebrow here, a pointed silence there, allowing the imaginations of listeners to fill in whatever gaps he left behind. The story spread quickly, as such stories always do, gaining new details with each retelling, until it bore only a distant resemblance to the truth. By the time it reached Eleanor's ears, she was horrified to learn that people now spoke of her father as though he had been some manner of criminal, his memory tarnished by lies she could not immediately trace back to their source. She confronted her aunt first, desperate for some explanation, some reassurance that the stories could not possibly be true. Constance, to her credit, seemed genuinely uncertain, though her uncertainty offered little comfort. "I do not know where such stories began," Constance admitted, her usual confidence faltering slightly under the weight of Eleanor's distress. "Your father was, to my knowledge, an honest man, difficult as our relationship sometimes was. But you must understand, Eleanor, that once a rumor takes hold in society, the truth matters very little in stopping its spread." Eleanor spent that night unable to sleep, her mind racing through every possible source of the story, every person who might have reason to wish her harm. She thought of Reginald, whom she had met only briefly at a gathering some weeks before, his smile polite, but his eyes cold in a way that had left her faintly uneasy even then. She had no proof, only instinct, but instinct told her that the story had not arisen by accident. The following morning, she arrived at Carrickmuir Hall to find Nathaniel already aware of the rumors, his expression grave as he greeted her in the library. "I have heard what is being said," he told her without preamble. "I want you to know that I do not believe a word of it." "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly, though the weight of the past 2 days pressed heavily on her chest. "But I fear it will not matter what either of us believes. If society decides my family is dishonest, no amount of truth will undo the damage. I will not allow that to happen," Nathaniel said firmly, though even as he spoke, Eleanor could see the difficulty of the situation reflected in his eyes. He was a duke, respected and powerful within his own sphere, but even a duke's influence had limits when facing the momentum of gossip already set into motion. Over the following days, the situation grew steadily worse. Invitations that Eleanor might once have received began quietly disappearing. Acquaintances who had once greeted her warmly now offered only cool, distant nods before turning away. Even the servants at her aunt's household, though they said nothing directly, seemed to regard her with a new wariness that had not existed before the rumors began. The worst moment came at a garden party hosted by one of the more prominent families in society, an event Eleanor had attended reluctantly, hoping her presence might help quiet some of the rumors rather than confirm them. Instead, she found herself surrounded by careful, cutting remarks disguised as polite conversation, questions about her father's business dealings phrased with false innocence, comments about the wisdom of marrying into families with, as one woman delicately put it, complicated histories. Reginald himself was present at the gathering, watching the scene unfold from a comfortable distance with an expression of quiet satisfaction he took no particular care to hide from anyone paying close attention. When Eleanor finally caught his eye across the garden, something in his expression confirmed what her instincts had already told her. He had orchestrated this. He had taken her family's private grief and twisted it into a weapon aimed directly at destroying everything she had begun to build. She left the gathering early, her composure barely holding until she reached the privacy of the carriage, where she finally allowed herself to weep, the tears she had held back for days finally breaking free. She thought of Nathaniel, of the quiet happiness they had found together in the library, of the careful, growing affection that had begun to feel, for the first time since her parents' death, like something worth hoping for. And she thought of how quickly, how easily, it all seemed to be slipping away, not because of anything she had done, but because of who she was, where she had come from, and how easily the world seemed willing to believe the worst of a girl with no power to defend herself. That evening she wrote a letter to Nathaniel, her hand trembling as she formed each careful word. She explained that she could not continue their work at Carrickmuir Hall, that the rumors had grown too dangerous, too damaging, not only to her own reputation but potentially to his as well. She wrote that she would not be responsible for bringing scandal upon a family that had already shown her more kindness than she had any right to expect, and that perhaps, in the end, her aunt had been correct after all. Perhaps she truly was not meant for the kind of life she had briefly allowed herself to imagine. She sent the letter before she could reconsider, sealing it with a heavy heart, and the following morning, she began quietly making arrangements of her own. Through a distant acquaintance of her mother's, she learned of a position as governess to a family in a county far removed from the society that had so thoroughly turned against her. It was not the life she had once imagined for herself, but it was honest work, far from the whispers and judgment that had followed her since her parents' death, and it felt, in that dark moment, like the only path left available to her. She did not tell her aunt of her plans immediately, not trusting Constance's reaction, whether it might be relief at finally being free of the burden Eleanor represented, or a renewed, self-interested effort to salvage whatever social advantage might still be gained from the connection to the Duke. Instead, she began quietly packing her few belongings, preparing to leave the only remaining pieces of her old life behind, including, she believed, any hope of the happiness she had glimpsed so briefly within the walls of Carrickmuir Hall. Nathaniel received her letter the following afternoon, and the words on the page struck him with a force he had not expected. He read it once, then again, searching for some misunderstanding, some way to interpret her words that did not mean what he feared they meant. But there was no mistaking the finality in her tone, the quiet resignation of someone who had convinced herself that giving up was the only honorable choice remaining to her. He sat for a long while in the silence of his study, the letter resting on the desk before him, anger and determination slowly replacing the initial shock of her words. He thought of the dinner party where he had first witnessed her quiet strength, of the weeks they had spent together in the library, of every small moment that had convinced him, more surely with each passing day, that Eleanor Whitmore was not someone he was willing to lose without a fight. He thought, too, of his cousin Reginald, of the careful timing of the rumors, of the convenient way they had emerged just as Eleanor's happiness seemed most secure. Suspicion sharpened into certainty as he considered every detail, every small inconsistency in the stories now circulating through society. He did not yet have proof, but he intended to find it, whatever the cost, and he intended to make certain that the truth, however inconvenient it might be for his cousin, finally reached the ears of everyone who had so readily believed the worst of a young woman who had done nothing to deserve such treatment. He rose from his desk with new purpose, calling for his carriage to be prepared immediately. There was work to be done, and he did not intend to waste another moment allowing lies to determine the fate of someone who mattered to him more than he had realized, until the very real possibility of losing her had suddenly become so close to reality. Nathaniel arrived at Reginald's townhouse just as the afternoon light began to fade, his patience worn thin by the carriage ride spent turning over every detail he had gathered in the hours since reading Eleanor's letter. He had spoken first with his solicitor, a careful, thorough man named Mr. Halloway, who had once handled certain financial matters for Eleanor's father years before, and still kept records of the old business dispute now being twisted into scandal. What Nathaniel learned from those records confirmed everything his instincts had already told him, that the disagreement had been nothing more than an honest difference of opinion between business partners, resolved fairly and without any hint of dishonesty on either side. There had been no fraud, there had been no deception, there had only been an old, forgotten dispute, revived and reshaped into something far uglier by someone with a clear motive for wanting Eleanor's reputation destroyed. Reginald received his cousin with the same easy smile he always wore, though something in his eyes flickered with unease as Nathaniel entered the study without waiting to be properly announced. "Nathaniel," Reginald said, rising from his chair, "this is an unexpected visit. I trust nothing is wrong." "I think you know exactly why I am here," Nathaniel said, his voice controlled but carrying an edge his cousin had rarely heard before. "I have spoken with Mr. Halloway. I have seen the records regarding Eleanor's father. There was no fraud, Reginald. There was no dishonesty, only a business disagreement, settled fairly, years before Eleanor was even born." Reginald's smile faltered slightly, though he recovered quickly, settling back into his chair with practiced calm. "I am not certain what you expect me to say to that. Rumors travel through society constantly, Nathaniel. Surely you do not believe I am responsible for every story that circulates among our acquaintances." "I believe you are responsible for this one," Nathaniel said flatly. "The timing is too convenient, Reginald. The details too carefully chosen to cause the most damage. You have spent years assuming this title would eventually pass to you, given my own reluctance toward marriage. The moment that assumption became threatened, this story appeared. I do not think that is coincidence." For a long moment, Reginald said nothing, the silence stretching uncomfortably between them until finally, something in his composed expression cracked. "And if I did have some small part in it," he said, his voice losing its earlier smoothness, "can you truly blame me? I have spent years planning a future built on the expectation of this title. You show no interest in marriage for years and then suddenly, a penniless relation catches your attention, and everything I have built is at risk of disappearing entirely. That does not give you the right to destroy an innocent woman's reputation to protect your own interests," Nathaniel said, his anger now fully evident. "Eleanor has done nothing to deserve what you have put her through. Her father was an honest man. She herself has shown more integrity in the past weeks than you have shown in years of comfortable assumption." Reginald's jaw tightened, but he offered no further defense, seeming to understand, perhaps for the first time, the full weight of what his actions had set into motion. Nathaniel did not linger long after that, having gathered what he needed, not a confession suitable for formal accusation, but confirmation enough for his own certainty, and a clear understanding that the matter would need to be addressed publicly if Eleanor's reputation was to be properly restored. He spent the following 2 days quietly gathering support, speaking with respected members of society whose word carried enough weight to help shift public opinion, sharing the records from Mr. Halloway that proved beyond doubt the honesty of Eleanor's father's business dealings, It was delicate work, requiring both patience and careful diplomacy, for he knew that simply declaring the rumors false would not be enough. He needed proof, clearly presented, and he needed it delivered in a setting where it could not easily be dismissed or ignored. The opportunity came at a large gathering hosted by one of the most influential families in society, an event that nearly everyone of importance, including Constance and several of the very people who had spread the original rumors, would be certain to attend. Nathaniel arrived with quiet determination, aware that what he was about to do carried real risk to his own reputation, drawing attention to a scandal that some might argue he should have simply allowed to fade quietly with time. But he had never been a man willing to let injustice stand simply because confronting it proved inconvenient, and he was not about to change that now, not when the cost of silence was Eleanor's happiness and reputation. He waited until conversation had settled into its usual rhythm before requesting a brief moment of everyone's attention, a request unusual enough from a man of his typically reserved nature that the room quieted almost immediately, curiosity overtaking the usual chatter. "I understand that certain stories have been circulating regarding the family of Miss Eleanor Whitmore," he began, his voice steady and carrying clearly across the room. "I have spent the past several days investigating these claims thoroughly, and I can state, with complete confidence and documented proof, that they are entirely false. Miss Whitmore's father was an honest, respected man whose only misfortune was an ordinary business disagreement, resolved fairly many years ago. The stories suggesting otherwise were fabricated, and I believe deliberately so, in order to cause harm to a young woman who has done nothing to deserve such treatment." A murmur spread through the room, glances shifting uneasily between Nathaniel and the gathered crowd, several faces turning toward Constance, who stood frozen near the refreshment table, her expression caught somewhere between embarrassment and disbelief. "I will not name the source of these rumors publicly," Nathaniel continued, his eyes briefly finding Reginald across the room, "though I suspect those responsible understand quite clearly that I know the truth of the matter. What I will say is this. Miss Whitmore has shown more honesty, more strength, and more grace under difficult circumstances than most people in this room could claim for themselves. I would ask that anyone who values fairness reconsider the judgments they have made based on stories with no foundation in truth." The room remained quiet for a long moment after he finished speaking, the weight of his words settling over the gathered crowd. Slowly, conversation began to resume, though the tone had shifted noticeably, the earlier gossip now replaced by quiet reconsideration, several guests exchanging uncertain glances as they processed what they had just heard. Constance approached Nathaniel later that evening, her usual confidence considerably diminished. "I did not know," she said quietly, "that the stories were false. I should have questioned them more carefully before allowing them to spread through my own conversations." "You should have questioned a great many things more carefully, Lady Ashford," Nathaniel replied, though his tone held less anger than weary disappointment, "including the way you have treated your niece since the day she came to live under your roof." Constance had no response to offer, the truth of his words settling uncomfortably over her. For the first time in a long while, she found herself confronting the consequences of her own careless words, spoken so casually at that first dinner party. Words that had set into motion a chain of events she could never have fully anticipated. She thought of Eleanor's quiet endurance through months of cold treatment, of the many small cruelties she had allowed herself without ever truly considering their weight, and something in her, however imperfectly, began to shift. Meanwhile, Eleanor remained unaware of the events unfolding in society, having spent the past several days finalizing her arrangements to leave for her position as governess. She had packed the last of her belongings into a single modest trunk, the wooden box containing her parents' remaining possessions carefully placed on top, and had said her quiet goodbyes to the few servants in her aunt's household who had shown her genuine kindness over the past year. She had not seen Nathaniel since sending her letter, and though a part of her longed to know how he had received her decision, she told herself it was better this way, cleaner, less painful than a prolonged farewell that would only make leaving more difficult than it already was. She believed, in the quiet resignation that had settled over her since the garden party, that her aunt's original judgment had simply been proven correct in the end. She was not meant for the life she had briefly allowed herself to imagine. Constance found her that evening, sitting quietly in her room, folding the last of her dresses into the waiting trunk. For a long moment, Constance simply stood in the doorway, uncertain how to begin what she had come to say. "Eleanor," she said finally, her voice softer than Eleanor had heard it in a very long time, "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, I think, though I am not certain where to begin offering them." Eleanor looked up, surprised by the unfamiliar gentleness in her aunt's tone. "What has happened?" "The Duke," Constance said, has spent the past several days proving that the rumors regarding your father were entirely false, fabricated by someone with reason to see you fail. He spoke of it publicly this evening, defending your family's honor before half of society. I should have questioned those stories from the beginning, rather than allowing them to spread through careless conversation. I have not been the aunt you deserved, Eleanor, not since the day you came to live in this house, and I am sorry for that, more sorry than I know how to properly express. Eleanor sat in stunned silence, processing the weight of her aunt's words alongside the news of what Nathaniel had done. He had not simply accepted her decision to leave. He had fought, publicly and at real risk to his own reputation, to restore what the rumors had so nearly destroyed. The realization settled over her slowly, warmth spreading through the numbness that had settled in her chest since the garden party. "Thank you for telling me," Eleanor said quietly, though her mind was already racing ahead, considering what this new information might mean for the plans she had so carefully arranged. Constance lingered a moment longer, seeming to want to say more, though whatever additional words she might have offered remained unspoken, as she finally excused herself, leaving Eleanor alone once more with her half-packed trunk, and a heart now caught between the safe, quiet future she had planned, and the uncertain, hopeful possibility that perhaps, despite everything, she had not lost what she believed she had lost after all. She did not sleep well that night, her thoughts returning again and again to Nathaniel's public defense of her family's honor, to the risk he had taken, to the quiet strength of a man who had chosen to stand beside her, even when doing so proved difficult. By morning, she had made no final decision, though the certainty she had felt just days before, the conviction that leaving was her only honorable choice, had begun to waver in ways she had not expected. The carriage that would carry her to her new position as governess was scheduled to arrive within 2 days, and Eleanor found herself caught in a quiet, uncertain waiting, unsure whether the life she had planned to accept was truly the life she wanted, or simply the life she had convinced herself she deserved. The morning of Eleanor's departure arrived gray and quiet, a soft rain falling over the city as the servants loaded her single trunk onto the waiting carriage. She stood in the entrance hall of her aunt's house, dressed in her traveling clothes, feeling strangely hollow despite the certainty she had tried so hard to convince herself of over the past 2 days. She had told herself repeatedly that this was the sensible choice, the safe choice, a quiet life far removed from the judgment and gossip that had followed her since her parents' death. But standing there in the entrance hall, watching the rain streak down the windows, she felt none of the peace she had hoped such certainty might bring. Constance appeared beside her, her expression unusually soft. "You do not have to go, you know," she said quietly. "Whatever has passed between yourself and the Duke, whatever uncertainty remains, you are always welcome to remain here, Eleanor. I have not always shown you the kindness you deserved, but that does not mean the door must close on whatever future you still hope to find." Eleanor managed a small, grateful smile, though she said nothing in response, uncertain how to explain the tangled mixture of hope and fear that had kept her awake through the past 2 nights. She was saved from needing to answer by the sound of hooves on the gravel drive outside, a carriage approaching far too quickly for the quiet rhythm of an ordinary morning. She turned toward the window just as Nathaniel stepped down from his own carriage, moving toward the house with a purposeful stride that spoke of urgency rather than formal visitation. Eleanor's heart caught in her throat as the front door opened and he entered, rain still clinging to his coat, his expression a mixture of relief and determination, as his eyes found hers immediately across the entrance hall. "You are still here," he said, something close to relief evident in his voice. "I feared I had arrived too late." "I was only just leaving," Eleanor managed, her voice unsteady. "Then I am glad my timing was not quite as poor as I feared." He glanced briefly at Constance, who, with unusual tact, excused herself quietly from the hall, leaving the two of them alone amid the quiet sound of rain against the windows. "I received your letter," Nathaniel said, stepping closer. "I understand why you wrote it. The rumors, the fear of bringing scandal upon people you cared for, I understand all of it, Eleanor. But I could not simply accept it, not without telling you plainly what I should have told you long before any of this began." Eleanor said nothing, waiting, her heart beating loudly enough that she felt certain he must be able to hear it. "Your aunt was wrong," Nathaniel continued, his voice steady, despite the emotion evident beneath it. "Wrong that first night, and wrong every day since, that she has judged your worth by your dowry, or your circumstances, or anything beyond the truth of who you actually are. I did not seek your company these past months out of pity, nor out of some passing curiosity. I sought it because from the very first evening I watched you endure cruelty with more grace than most people manage in a lifetime. I recognized something in you I had not encountered in anyone else. Strength, honesty, A quiet resilience that has only grown clearer to me with every day we have spent together. Eleanor felt tears gathering, though for the first time in a long while, they were not tears of grief or humiliation, but something warmer, something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Nathaniel, I do not know what to say. Say that you will not climb into that carriage bound for a life you do not truly want, he said, taking her hands gently in his own. Say that you will consider, instead, a different future, one built not on obligation or pity, but on genuine partnership, on the kind of understanding I have not found with anyone else since losing my sister. I am asking you to marry me, Eleanor, not because it would please society, nor because it would silence any remaining rumors, but because I cannot imagine continuing this life without you beside me. For a long moment Eleanor could not speak, the weight of his words settling over her alongside a year of grief, uncertainty, and quiet endurance that had brought her, unexpectedly, to this single moment. She thought of her aunt's cruel words at that first dinner party, words that had once felt like a final judgment on her worth. She thought of the months since, of every small cruelty and every genuine kindness that had shaped the path leading her here, to this entrance hall, rain falling softly beyond the windows, a man she had come to love standing before her with his heart laid entirely open. Yes, she said finally, the word breaking free on a small, disbelieving laugh. Yes, Nathaniel, I will marry you. The relief and joy that broke across his face in that moment was unlike anything Eleanor had witnessed from him before. The careful reserve he carried so constantly, finally giving way entirely to open happiness. He drew her gently into an embrace, and for the first time since her parents' death, Eleanor allowed herself to fully believe that the life ahead of her might hold more joy than sorrow, more warmth than loss. News of their engagement spread through society far more quickly than the earlier rumors had, though this time, the whispers carried a different tone entirely. Curiosity replaced gradually by genuine respect for a young woman who had endured so much hardship only to find such an unexpected, well-earned happiness. Those who had once questioned her worth now found themselves reconsidering their earlier judgments, though Eleanor, in truth, cared little for their revised opinions. She had learned, through the difficult months leading to this moment, that her value had never truly depended on society's approval, however painful it had once felt to believe otherwise. Reginald, upon learning of the engagement, made no further attempt to interfere, understanding clearly that any further scheming would only bring greater scrutiny upon his own conduct. He quietly withdrew from society's attention for some time afterward, his ambitions for the Carrickmuir title now permanently set aside, though Nathaniel, in a final act of quiet generosity that surprised even Eleanor, chose not to pursue any formal consequence against his cousin, believing that the public exposure of his actions had already delivered sufficient consequence of its own. The wedding itself took place several months later, on a clear autumn morning, very different from the rainy day of Nathaniel's proposal. It was a modest ceremony by the standards of the aristocracy, held in the small chapel near Carrickmuir Hall, rather than the grand cathedral society might have expected for a duke's wedding. Eleanor had insisted on simplicity, wanting the day to reflect the genuine warmth of their relationship rather than the elaborate display so often expected of such occasions, and Nathaniel had agreed without hesitation, understanding exactly why such simplicity mattered so deeply to her. Constance attended, seated near the front of the small gathering, her expression a careful mixture of pride and quiet reflection, as she watched her niece walk toward the altar. In the months since Eleanor's engagement, something had genuinely shifted in their relationship, Constance making real, if imperfect, efforts to repair the damage caused by her earlier cruelty. She would never be the warm, nurturing presence Eleanor had once known in her own mother, but she had, in her own limited way, begun to show a genuine care that Eleanor had not expected to receive from her again. Mrs. Averley stood among the small gathering of household staff invited to witness the ceremony, dabbing quietly at her eyes as she watched the Duke, a man she had feared might remain forever closed off following his sister's death, exchange vows with a radiant, genuine happiness she had not witnessed from him in years. The library at Carrickmuir Hall, now fully catalogued and organized, stood as quiet testament to how their story had begun, a place that would remain, for both of them, a symbol of the unexpected connection found among old books and shared grief. As the ceremony concluded and the small gathering moved outside into the crisp autumn air, Eleanor found herself standing quietly beside Nathaniel, watching the modest celebration unfold around them, filled with the genuine warmth of people who had come to know and respect her, not for her title or her fortune, but for the person she had proven herself to be through months of quiet strength and enduring grace. She thought, in that peaceful moment, of her aunt's cruel words from so many months before, words that had once felt like a permanent judgment on her worth, a sentence she believed she might never escape. She understood now, standing beside a man who had chosen her not out of obligation but out of genuine love, that those words had never held the power over her future that she had once feared. They had only revealed, in the end, the kind of man capable of looking past careless cruelty to see the truth of a person's character, and in doing so, they had led her, however painfully, to exactly where she was always meant to be. Constance watched from a short distance as Eleanor and Nathaniel greeted their guests together, and for the first time in a very long while, she allowed herself to feel something close to genuine pride, tempered by the quiet understanding that her own cruelty had come dangerously close to costing her niece the happiness, now so clearly evident on her face. It was a lesson she would carry with her for the remainder of her days, a reminder that the careless words spoken in a moment of thoughtlessness could echo far longer, and far more painfully, than she had ever imagined possible. As the autumn sun began to set over Carrickmuir Hall, casting warm golden light across the gathered guests, Eleanor Whitmore, now Duchess of Carrickmuir, stood beside the man who had proven, in every possible way, that her aunt's harsh judgment had been wrong from the very beginning. She had not needed a grand fortune or a flawless reputation to be worthy of genuine love. She had needed only someone willing to see past the careless words of others to the true strength and grace that had carried her through the hardest year of her life, and in Nathaniel Graves, she had finally found exactly that.